He thought he was humiliating a nobody, but he had no idea he had just insulted the woman who would decide his future. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and if you believe dignity still matters in this world, stay with this story. The morning light spilled across the polished marble floors of Silverline Luxury Motors, casting long reflections of cars that cost more than most homes. And through those glass doors walked Emily Carter, her steps quiet, almost invisible, her worn sneakers barely making a sound against the gleaming surface, her simple jeans and light gray sweater standing in quiet contrast to the tailored suits and designer heels around her. And for a moment, no one noticed her, or perhaps more truthfully, they noticed and chose not to see, because in a place where value was measured in price tags and polished appearances, Emily did not fit the picture they had already decided was worthy. She paused beside a midnight blue coupe displayed under a spotlight, her eyes steady, thoughtful, not the wide-eyed curiosity of someone dreaming, but the calm focus of someone deciding. And as she reached out to lightly trace the curve of the car's hood, a salesman across the room nudged another, their whispers low but sharp, their smirks quick and practiced, the kind that came from years of judging people in seconds. No one approached her, no one greeted her, no one offered assistance, because in that room, service was reserved for those who looked like they could afford it, and Emily, to them, looked like a mistake. At the center of the showroom stood Blake Thompson, the sales manager, adjusting his cufflinks as he scanned the floor with the confidence of someone who believed he could read a person's worth at a glance. And when his eyes landed on Emily, they lingered just long enough for a faint smirk to form, not out of curiosity, but out of dismissal. He turned away at first, choosing instead to greet a well-dressed couple entering behind her, his voice warm, welcoming, almost rehearsed, but his attention kept drifting back, drawn not by interest, but by irritation, as if her mere presence disrupted the order he had carefully constructed. Emily remained where she was, patient, composed, her gaze still on the car, as though the room's indifference did not touch her, as though she had seen this before, many times, in many places, and had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than words ever could. Minutes passed, and still no one came, until finally Blake made his way toward her, his smile polite but thin, the kind that never reached his eyes, and as he approached, the quiet tension in the room shifted, subtle but real, like the air before a storm that no one yet recognized. He stopped just a few feet away, straightened his posture, and looked her up and down, not openly enough to be called rude, but not carefully enough to hide the judgment either. And in that moment, without realizing it, Blake Thompson had already made the decision that would change everything. Because sometimes the smallest act of disrespect is the first step toward a downfall no one sees coming. And Emily Carter, she noticed every second of it. Blake let the silence stretch just long enough to establish control before speaking, his voice smooth but edged with something colder beneath the surface, something practiced and precise. And as Emily turned her attention toward him, her expression calm, he offered a brief nod that felt more like acknowledgement of an inconvenience than a greeting, asking if she needed assistance in a tone that suggested he already knew the answer, already assumed it. And when she replied quietly that she was interested in learning more about the midnight blue coupe, his eyes flickered with restrained amusement, the kind that came from hearing something he did not take seriously. And for a brief second, he glanced toward the other salesman across the showroom, as if sharing a private joke without words. He stepped closer, positioning himself between her and the vehicle, not aggressively, but deliberately, creating a barrier that was subtle enough to deny and obvious enough to be felt. And he began listing the specifications of the car in a voice that was overly formal, overly simplified, as though explaining something basic to someone who would not understand, emphasizing the price, the exclusivity, the limited availability, repeating numbers with a certain weight as if they alone should end the conversation. Emily listened without interrupting, her posture relaxed, her eyes steady, absorbing every word without reacting. And when he finished, she asked politely if she could see the interior, a simple request, delivered without hesitation, but Blake's smile tightened slightly at the corners as he responded that viewings were typically reserved for serious clients with scheduled appointments, his tone still polite, but now carrying a sharper edge. one that suggested boundaries she was not meant to cross. Around them, the showroom continued its quiet rhythm, but a few nearby customers had begun to notice, their conversations lowering, their attention drifting, sensing the shift in energy that always accompanied moments like this, moments where judgment moved from thought into action. Emily nodded slowly, acknowledging his words, then asked if it would be possible to schedule an appointment later that day, her voice unchanged, measured, giving him every opportunity to treat her with the same respect he offered others. But Blake exhaled softly through his nose, a near invisible sign of impatience. Before explaining that the waiting list for that model extended several months, and that priority was given to established clients, his gaze briefly dropping to her shoes before returning to her face, the implication clear without needing to be spoken aloud. A faint murmur passed between two employees nearby, quickly stifled, but not unnoticed, and still Emily did not react, did not argue, did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, considering, as though weighing something far beyond the conversation itself. Blake shifted his stance, glancing once more toward the entrance where a new pair of well-dressed customers had just arrived, his attention already pulling away, his decision already made, and with a final, courteous but dismissive nod, he suggested that she might find more suitable options at one of their partner locations, places that catered to a broader range of budgets, his words carefully chosen, his meaning unmistakable. And for the first time, a quiet stillness settled between them, heavier than before, not filled with embarrassment, not filled with anger, but with something far more unsettling, the calm awareness of a moment that would not be forgotten, because as Emily Carter stood there in that polished showroom, she was not being turned away from a car, she was being shown exactly how easily people reveal who they are when they believe no one important is watching. Emily did not move immediately after Blake finished speaking, and for a moment, the space between them felt suspended, as though the entire showroom had subtly leaned in to see what she would do next. But instead of arguing or defending herself, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind that acknowledged more than just his words, the kind that recognized the intention behind them. And then she stepped slightly to the side, her gaze drifting once more over the car, not with longing, but with quiet certainty, as if confirming a decision she had already made long before she walked through those doors. Blake, already turning away, paused just enough to ensure she understood that the conversation was over, his attention shifting fully toward the newly arrived customers, his posture straightening, his smile widening, his tone transforming instantly into warmth and enthusiasm, greeting them with a level of respect and attentiveness that had never been offered to her. And the contrast was unmistakable, not only to Emily, but to the few onlookers who had witnessed the exchange, their eyes moving between the two interactions, as if comparing two entirely different worlds existing within the same room. One of the younger sales associates hesitated nearby, glancing at Emily with something close to discomfort, as if recognizing that something about the situation was not right, but not possessing the confidence to intervene, and he quickly looked away when Blake's voice carried across the floor, sharp enough to pull everyone back into their roles. Emily turned slowly toward the exit, her steps measured, unhurried, each one echoing softly against the marble, and as she walked, the reflections of the cars shimmered around her, distorted and distant, like illusions that had already lost their appeal. Just before reaching the glass doors, she paused again, not because she was unsure, but because she was observant, her eyes scanning the showroom one final time, taking in the layout, the people, the expressions, the subtle hierarchy that dictated who was welcomed and who was dismissed, and there was no anger in her face, no visible frustration, only a calm awareness that settled deeper with each passing second. Behind her, Blake laughed lightly at something one of the new customers said, his voice confident, unaware, already moving on, already convinced that the moment had passed without consequence. But there are moments that do not announce their importance when they happen, moments that seem small, ordinary, forgettable, yet quietly shape what comes next in ways no one expects. Emily reached for the door, her fingers wrapping around the cool metal handle, and as she pushed it open, the outside air greeted her with a gentle breeze, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and life beyond the polished silence of the showroom. And she stepped out without looking back, the door closing behind her with a soft click that seemed almost insignificant, yet somehow final. Inside, the showroom returned to its usual rhythm. Conversations resumed, deals continued, and Blake Thompson carried on with the assurance of someone who believed he had handled the situation exactly as he should have. But what he did not realize, what no one in that room realized, was that the woman who had just walked out had not left defeated or embarrassed. She had left with clarity. And sometimes clarity is far more dangerous than anger, because it does not rush, it does not react. It waits, it observes, and when the moment comes, it changes everything without raising its voice. And somewhere beyond those glass doors, Emily Carter was already deciding what that moment would look like. The next morning arrived with a quiet precision that felt almost deliberate, as if time itself had slowed just enough to prepare for something unseen. And as the sun climbed over the city skyline, its light reflected once again across the glass walls of Silverline Luxury Motors, illuminating the same polished floors, the same lineup of pristine vehicles, and the same staff moving through their routines with practiced confidence, unaware that the rhythm of their day was about to be interrupted, in a way none of them could predict. Blake Thompson stood near the center of the showroom, reviewing sales figures on his tablet, his expression focused, satisfied. The memory of the previous day, already fading into insignificance, filed away as just another minor inconvenience in a career built on quick judgments and confident decisions. And as he adjusted his tie and glanced toward the entrance, he expected nothing more than another ordinary day, filled with familiar faces and predictable outcomes. Outside, the distant hum of engines grew louder, not abrupt, not aggressive, but steady, controlled, drawing subtle attention from a few employees near the front windows, their curiosity piqued by the sight of a sleek black convoy turning slowly into the dealership driveway, each vehicle moving in perfect alignment, their glossy surfaces catching the morning light in sharp, deliberate reflections. Conversations inside the showroom began to quiet. Not entirely, but enough for a shift to be felt, a subtle change in energy that moved through the space like a ripple, and Blake, noticing the distraction, looked up just as the first car came to a smooth stop directly in front of the entrance, its presence commanding attention without a single word. The doors opened almost in unison, and from the lead vehicle stepped a man whose presence seemed to carry its own gravity, his tailored navy suit fitting with effortless precision, his posture calm, composed, his expression unreadable yet unmistakably authoritative, and those who recognized him did so instantly. Their reactions subtle but telling, a straightened posture here, a quick exchange of glances there, the quiet recognition of someone who did not need introduction. Behind him, two additional individuals emerged, one carrying a slim leather portfolio, the other speaking quietly into a phone, their movements coordinated, purposeful, suggesting that this was not a casual visit, not a spontaneous stop, but something planned, something intentional. Blake's confidence shifted, just slightly, as he moved toward the entrance, his steps measured, his smile already forming, ready to adapt, ready to impress, because in his world, appearances dictated opportunity, and this was clearly an opportunity he did not intend to miss. The glass doors opened, and as the man stepped inside, the room seemed to tighten around him, the usual ambient noise fading into a controlled silence, and Blake extended his hand with practiced ease, greeting him with enthusiasm, his tone respectful, eager, unaware that every word he spoke now carried weight far beyond what he understood. And then, just a few steps behind that man, walking in with the same quiet composure as the day before, wearing the same simple clothes, her expression unchanged, was Emily Carter, and in that moment, before a single word was exchanged, before any explanation was given, something in the room shifted completely, because recognition does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives in silence. In the sudden realization that everything you thought you understood was about to be proven wrong. Blake's outstretched hand lingered in the air for a fraction too long as his eyes shifted past the man in front of him and landed on Emily. And in that instant, the confidence he had carefully constructed began to fracture, not dramatically, not in a way anyone could immediately point to, but subtly, like a crack forming beneath a polished surface. And though he quickly recovered, lowering his hand and forcing a professional smile, The change had already been noticed by those closest to him. The man in the navy suit did not take Blake's hand right away. Instead, he turned slightly, his gaze moving toward Emily with a quiet acknowledgement, a small nod that carried familiarity, respect, and something more, something that did not belong to a casual acquaintance. And Emily stepped forward just enough to stand beside him, not behind, not waiting, but present, equal, composed, her calm demeanor unchanged from the day before, as if the previous encounter had been nothing more than a minor detail in a much larger picture. The room, once filled with low conversation and subtle movement, fell into a near-complete stillness, the kind that arrives when people sense that something important is unfolding but do not yet understand what it is. And Blake cleared his throat lightly, adjusting his posture, his tone shifting into one of heightened attentiveness as he addressed the man again, offering assistance, offering service, offering everything that had been withheld just 24 hours earlier. The man finally turned back to him, his expression steady, his voice measured, introducing himself as Daniel Carter, and the name alone moved through the room like a quiet signal, triggering recognition in those who followed industry news, those who understood influence, those who knew that decisions made by people like him did not just affect sales numbers. They shaped entire businesses, entire futures. Blake's smile widened, now genuine but edged with urgency, his mind already recalculating, already repositioning, as he began to speak about their finest models, their exclusive inventory, their commitment to excellence. Each word carefully chosen, each sentence crafted to impress, to recover, to re-establish control over a situation that was slipping further from his grasp with every passing second. Daniel listened without interruption, his gaze steady, but there was no engagement in his expression, no sign that the presentation was having the intended effect. And when Blake finally paused, expecting a response, expecting interest, expecting the familiar rhythm of negotiation to begin, Daniel did not comment on the cars, he did not ask about pricing, he did not acknowledge the features or the prestige. Instead, he asked a single, simple question, his tone calm but precise, asking who had assisted his wife the previous day. The word hung in the air, unmistakable, undeniable, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because the implications settled instantly, reshaping everything that had happened, everything that had been assumed, everything that Blake believed he understood. His expression faltered, just briefly, as his eyes flicked toward Emily again, searching for confirmation, for contradiction, for anything that might allow him to reframe the situation. But Emily said nothing, her gaze steady, her silence more revealing than any explanation could have been. Around them, the employees stood frozen in place, the earlier whispers replaced by a heavy, attentive quiet, and Blake felt the weight of that silence pressing in, the awareness that the roles had shifted, that the balance he relied on had already been overturned, and for the first time since Emily had walked into the showroom, he was no longer in control of the narrative unfolding before him. Blake felt the weight of the question settle over him like a spotlight he could not step out of, and for a brief moment, his usual confidence faltered, his mind racing through the events of the previous day, replaying every word, every gesture, every decision he had made, searching for a version of it that could still be justified, that could still be defended, but the silence in the room offered him no escape, only expectation, and he cleared his throat again, forcing a small, controlled smile. As he stepped forward, attempting to regain composure, explaining that he personally handled most client interactions and that there may have been a misunderstanding, his tone carefully neutral, carefully measured, as if the right phrasing could soften what had already been done. Daniel listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, his eyes steady, and when Blake finished speaking, there was no immediate response, only a pause that stretched just long enough to make the absence of words feel deliberate, meaningful, and then Daniel turned slightly toward the man standing beside him, the one holding the leather portfolio, and gave a subtle nod. The man stepped forward, opening the portfolio with quiet precision, revealing neatly organized documents. And though the details were not visible from a distance, the formality of the action alone shifted the atmosphere even further, transforming what had seemed like a customer visit into something far more significant, something official. Daniel's voice, when he spoke again, was calm but carried a clarity that left no room for interpretation, as he explained that his firm had been in the final stages of evaluating several luxury dealerships for a substantial investment, one that would not only expand operations but also elevate the brand's national presence, and that Silverline had been among the top candidates, a statement that caused a visible ripple among the staff, their expressions tightening, their attention sharpening, the implications settling in almost instantly. Blake's posture stiffened, his earlier confidence now replaced with a growing awareness of what this meant, what this could have been, and what it was quickly becoming, and he began to speak again, more quickly this time, emphasizing their commitment to excellence, their customer service standards, their reputation, each word now carrying a subtle urgency that had not been there before. But Daniel raised a hand slightly, not to silence him aggressively, but to pause him, a small gesture that nonetheless carried authority, and the room fell quiet once more. He continued, explaining that while financial performance and inventory mattered, the decision ultimately came down to something less measurable, something that could not be listed on a balance sheet or presented in a report, and as he spoke, his gaze shifted briefly toward Emily, then back to Blake, making the connection unmistakable. Respect, he said simply, not as a lecture, not as an accusation, but as a fact, as a standard that had either been met or failed. Emily stood beside him, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, and in that moment, her silence carried more weight than any words could have, because everything that needed to be understood was already clear. Around them, the showroom remained still, the earlier confidence replaced by a quiet tension that settled into every corner of the space, and Blake, standing at the center of it, realized that this was no longer about a missed sale, no longer about a single interaction. It was about a decision that had already been made the moment he chose to see her as less than she was. A decision whose consequences were now unfolding in real time, in front of everyone, without a raised voice, without a second chance. And for the first time, he understood that some opportunities do not return once they are lost. The silence that followed Daniel's words did not break all at once. It lingered, stretched thin across the showroom like something fragile that no one dared disturb. And in that stillness, every person present felt the shift, not just in the conversation, but in the hierarchy that had governed the room only moments before, because what had once been assumed was now being quietly dismantled. Blake stood there, his hands clasped just tightly enough to betray the tension he could no longer fully conceal, his mind searching for something to say that could repair the damage, something that could reframe the situation. But the more he considered his options, the more he realized there were none that could undo what had already been revealed. He attempted once more, his voice softer now, less certain, offering an apology that was careful, controlled, directed toward Emily, acknowledging that perhaps the previous day had not been handled with the level of professionalism expected, his words chosen with precision, but lacking the one thing that could give them weight, authenticity. And as he spoke, it became clear that he was not addressing her as a person, but as a consequence. Emily listened, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and when he finished, she did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to settle again, not as punishment, but as clarity, because some truths do not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Around them, the employees remained still, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet awareness that they were witnessing something far more significant than a single interaction, something that would ripple beyond this moment into the future of the place they stood in. The young associate who had hesitated the day before now watched openly, his expression no longer uncertain but reflective, as if recognizing the weight of what had unfolded and the role that silence can play in allowing it to happen. Daniel remained composed, his presence steady, but it was clear that the decision was no longer his alone, because as he turned slightly toward Emily, the subtle shift in his posture acknowledged what had already become evident, that this moment, this outcome, rested with her. Emily took a small step forward, not dramatic, not forceful, but deliberate, and for the first time since she had entered the showroom the previous day, all attention focused entirely on her, not because she demanded it, but because it had been earned through something far more powerful than appearance or status, through quiet certainty. She spoke calmly, her voice even, without anger, without accusation, simply stating that the previous day had shown her exactly how people were treated when they were believed to have no value, and that no investment, no partnership, no future could be built on a foundation where respect was conditional. Her words were not raised, yet they carried through the room with unmistakable clarity, settling into the silence like something final. Blake's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat alone, but in recognition, the understanding that the outcome had already been decided long before this conversation began, and that nothing he said now could alter it. The man with the portfolio closed it quietly, the subtle motion signaling an end that required no further explanation, and Daniel gave a small nod, acknowledging what had been made clear without needing to repeat it. Around them, the showroom remained frozen in that moment, every polished surface reflecting not just light, but the realization that what had seemed like a simple dismissal had become something far greater, a turning point defined not by wealth or power, but by the quiet, undeniable presence of dignity. And in that stillness, the lesson did not need to be spoken again, because everyone in the room had already felt it. No one moved right away after Emily finished speaking, as if the entire showroom needed a moment to absorb what had just been said. And in that stillness, something intangible but undeniable settled over the space, something that could not be undone or explained away with polished words or rehearsed apologies. Blake stood where he was, his posture no longer commanding, his presence no longer central, and for the first time since he had stepped into his role at Silverline, he looked like a man who understood that control was an illusion, one that could disappear the moment it was challenged by something real. Around him, the employees shifted subtly, their attention no longer anchored to him, but to Emily, to Daniel, to the quiet authority that had entered the room without needing to announce itself. The young associate lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back up, as if committing the moment to memory, understanding that what he had witnessed was not just a lesson in business, but in character. Daniel glanced toward the entrance, a small, almost imperceptible signal, and the individuals who had arrived with him responded immediately, their movements efficient, purposeful, closing folders, exchanging brief nods, the kind of coordination that spoke of decisions already finalized. There was no need for further discussion, no need for negotiation, because everything that mattered had already been revealed in the simplest of interactions. Emily turned slightly, her eyes passing once more over the showroom, but this time, the way she looked at it was different, not as someone evaluating a purchase, but as someone closing a chapter, and there was no bitterness in her expression, no satisfaction in the outcome, only a quiet acceptance that what had happened was necessary, because sometimes the truth of a place is not found in its promises, but in how it treats those it believes have nothing to offer. Blake opened his mouth as if to speak again, perhaps to offer one more apology, one more attempt at recovery, but the words did not come, because even he could feel that anything he said now would arrive too late, that the moment for change had passed the instant he chose judgment over respect. Daniel gave him a brief, polite nod, not dismissive, not hostile, but final, the kind of acknowledgement that closes a conversation without needing to end it out loud. And then he turned, walking toward the exit with the same calm presence he had entered with, his step steady, unhurried. Emily followed beside him, her pace matched to his, not trailing behind, not leading ahead, but moving in quiet alignment. And as they approached the glass doors, the light from outside poured in again, bright, clear, almost symbolic in its contrast to the tension that had filled the room moments before. The doors opened, and the sound of the city filtered back in, distant engines, passing voices, the rhythm of life continuing without pause, and they stepped out together, leaving behind a space that no longer felt the same as it had before they arrived. Inside, no one spoke immediately, the silence returning, but now it carried a different weight, one shaped by realization rather than anticipation, and as Blake remained standing at the center of it, surrounded by the polished cars and reflective floors, he understood something he had never needed to consider before, that the value of a place is not measured by what it sells, but by how it treats those who walk through its doors, and in that moment, that realization echoed louder than anything else in the room. The doors closed softly behind Emily and Daniel, and for a moment, the world outside seemed brighter, clearer, as if untouched by what had just unfolded inside. And yet the impact of that moment continued to echo within the walls they had left behind, settling into every corner of the showroom with a quiet permanence that no one present could ignore. Inside, the staff remained scattered across the floor, but their movements had slowed, their conversations subdued, each person processing what they had witnessed in their own way, not as a spectacle, but as something far more personal, something that challenged the assumptions they carried into their work each day. The young associate who had hesitated before took a step forward, glancing toward the entrance where Emily had stood the day before, his expression thoughtful, as if replaying the moment when he could have spoken, when he could have acted differently, and realizing that silence, too, carries consequences. Blake remained near the center of the showroom, his tablet still in his hand, though he had long since stopped looking at it, the numbers on the screen now meaningless in comparison to the realization that had taken hold, and for the first time, the polished environment around him felt less like a place of control and more like a mirror, reflecting not success, but the cost of a decision made in seconds and remembered far longer. A few employees began quietly returning to their tasks, but the usual confidence was gone, replaced by a careful awareness, a shift in how they greeted the next customer, how they looked at the next person who walked through the door, because the lesson did not need to be repeated to be understood. Outside, Emily and Daniel walked toward the waiting cars, their pace steady, their conversation quiet, and though no words were exchanged about what had just happened, there was a shared understanding between them, not of victory, but of alignment, of values that did not need to be defended because they were lived, consistently, quietly, without exception. As Emily paused briefly before entering the car, she glanced back once, not at the building itself, but at the reflection in the glass, the faint image of the showroom behind her, and then she looked forward. Again, her expression calm, unchanged, because what had been revealed was not new to her, it was simply confirmed. The vehicles pulled away smoothly, merging into the flow of traffic, leaving behind a place that would continue operating, continue selling, continue presenting itself as refined and exclusive, but now carrying an invisible mark, a memory that would influence decisions yet to come, interactions yet to happen, and perhaps, in time, a change that would not have occurred without that single moment of quiet clarity. Back inside, the showroom slowly returned to motion, but it was not the same motion as before. It was more deliberate, more aware, shaped by the understanding that value is not something that can be displayed under bright lights or written on a price tag, but something revealed in the smallest interactions, the briefest encounters, the moments when no one important is believed to be watching. And as the day continued, that understanding lingered, not loudly, not forcefully, but steadily, like a truth that, once seen, cannot be unseen. And in that truth, the room carried forward a lesson that required no announcement, no explanation, only the quiet recognition that dignity does not ask for permission, and it does not depend on appearance. It simply exists, waiting to be acknowledged or ignored, and in either case, it always reveals who people truly are.